This is going to be about the seminar, one of the tools in our toolbox. The major purpose of the seminar is to take each and every proposition of the current theory of scientific change and scrutinize it. In this field, since the field is not really established, we cannot start from the theory proper. We cannot say, listen, these are the laws, let's study the laws. No. Physicists can do that, biologists can do that. All other established fields can do that. We cannot start from a theory proper. First thing we need to explain is, what is the scope of the theory? What sort of phenomena we need to explain? So that is the first question, the scope of the theory. And then once you understand what this theory should in principle be, what sort of things it needs to explain, then the second question we have to tackle, and this is an important question, we have to show that such a theory is possible, at least in principle, that it doesn't go against other established theories in our mosaic, that it's a viable project, that it's not completely utopian. If it turns out that such a project is impossible, there is no point in proceeding. So we first have to deal with very famous arguments against the general theory of scientific change. Once you know what your theory is, and once you know that it is possible, the next question you have to tackle is, suppose you created such a theory. How are you going to decide whether it's acceptable or not? And that's the third thing that we're going to do. The three together comprise what I call a meta-theory of scientific change, because this is not really the theory. This is just the preliminary discussion that makes the theory possible. So this is a meta-theory. It's safe to say that every field of science has a meta-theory implicit in it. They usually come in introduction to textbooks, or they come in philosophies of those disciplines, let's say philosophy of physics, philosophy of biology. Those things are the meta-theories that talk about the scope of the theory, talk about the assessment of the theory, the possibility of the theory. The good thing about those other fields of science is that they are so well established that these discussions are usually relegated to the corner, and they only surface when something incredibly important happens, when there's a huge transition in the mosaic, and then people start questioning the very foundations. But usually, if you're a physicist, you want to come up with a new theory, you can proceed to the theory proper immediately, without telling what a physical theory is supposed to be and how is it going to be assessed. The community knows that. They have some implicit meta-theory of physics, as opposed to our community. We're not even sure whether we have common expectations as to what a general theory of scientific change can possibly be. So we have to clarify the meta-theory first, before we can proceed to anything more substantial, to the meat and potatoes, as my friend Felix likes to say. And this is the meat and potatoes, the theory itself. We're going to proceed axiomatically. We have axioms and theorems. So altogether, this would be the theory of scientific change. Now, we're going to start with the scope. The first question is, this theory of scientific change, should it be descriptive, normative, or both? In other words, should it just describe how science changes through time, or should it tell us how science is supposed to be changing? Should it impose any norms? If you ask the classics of the genre, like Kuhn or Lakatos, they would say it's both. Nowadays, I don't think it's going to be both. It should be purely descriptive, but we have to discuss this. The next thing to discuss is the difference between construction and appraisal, and we have to clarify. It's one thing how the theory is constructed, how we generate an idea. It's another thing how an idea becomes accepted. Now, the question of a meta-theory is whether our theory should cover the process of theory construction, or whether it should cover the process of theory appraisal, or both. We need to clarify this from the outset. What is it that we require from our theory? The next question is the distinction between acceptance, use, and pursuit. We need to differentiate three stances towards theories. It's one thing to say that the theory is accepted, and we define acceptance as that stance when the community believes that the theory is the best available description of that particular object or a process. This should not be confused with use. We say that theory is used when the community believes that there is a practical application for a theory, no matter what kind of application. We can say that we believe that even astrology is useful because you can open an astrology boutique and make a lot of money. So use doesn't mean accepted. It's not the same thing. And finally, there's the third stance, which we call pursuit. And this is when you have an idea and you believe that the idea has the potential of turning into something big. Now, it is possible to accept one theory, use a different theory in practice, and pursue some other theory. Sometimes you have a theory that you accept, use, and pursue at the same time. But very often, these are different. I'm going to give you an example, a timeline. So you have accepted theories, used theories, and pursued theories. If I ask you nowadays, what are the physical theories that we accept? You probably say general relativity and quantum physics, right? But when it comes to practical applications, okay, in some cases, we do use general relativity. In some cases, yes, we use some quantum physics, all right. But in the 99% of all practical applications, we still use the good old classical physics. So if you're an engineer, you can't care less which one of these theories is the best available description of reality. What you do care about is whether it provides a useful calculating tool. So acceptance and use should not be confused. Both of them are legitimate stances, but they are different stances. Very often there are connections. We use a theory because we know it's the best, but sometimes you use the second best or the third best. And there is no clear logical connection between the two. In other cases, you use a theory that's no longer accepted, or accept a theory that has no use whatsoever. Finally, when it comes to pursuit of theories, I'm probably going to mention things like superstring theory. We do not accept this theory at the moment because we don't think that there is a proper test for that theory. We don't have it at the moment, but the community believes that it has a potential of being the next big thing. So this is a good example of a pursuit theory. Now, there are cases when the three coincide. Let's say in the early 19th century, the same Newtonian physics would be accepted and used in practical applications and pursued. But cases like this are far and few between in the history of science. If you go back to the early 17th century, you would see that the accepted theories would be Aristotelian medieval natural philosophy, Aristotelian physics of four elements, and then the Aristotelian medieval cosmology with concentric spheres. But when it came to practical applications like navigation or timekeeping, horology, or creating celestial charts for planets, none of these two would be particularly useful. You would have to use either a version of Ptolemaic astronomy, or many used even Copernicus's astronomy without believing a word of it. Very few people actually would accept the heliocentric astronomy. And yet in the second half of the 16th century, it became used in some communities, in particular in Wittenberg. They used it because it was very precise when it came to certain planets. Ptolemy's theory was slightly more useful when it came to calculation of other planets. So you can even use two inconsistent theories within the same practical application. There is no contradiction here. Think of it as having two hammers in your toolbox. When you get yourself a new hammer, you shouldn't necessarily get rid of the previous one. You can use both of them, right? And when it came to pursued theories, many of them pursued versions of heliocentric theory, and there were hybrid systems like Tychonic astronomy, and there were others. Now, the meta-theoretical question is which one of these three we should cover. Changes in which of these three stances should we trace? Should we explain how theories become pursued? Should we explain how theories become used? Or should we explain how theories become accepted? Or all of them, or any combination of them? So this is a meta-theoretical question. The next one is the difference between individual and social. So if we take acceptance, there are two ways in which we can understand this. It's one thing to say that the theory is accepted if the scientific community takes it as the best available description of its object. It's another thing to say that a theory is accepted if individual, let's say great scientists, take it as the best description of its object. So changes in which of these levels are we interested in? Are we talking about changes in belief systems of Einstein's and Galileo's? Or are we talking about changes in the mosaic of theories accepted by the community? These are by no means the same. These are two different levels of organization, and we have to figure out which one we are interested in. The next clarification is explicit and implicit. Now we already know the method is one thing, methodology is another thing. Method is a set of requirements that can actually be employed in theory assessment. Methodology is our attempt to openly state those requirements. Methodology would be the rules openly prescribed by the community as the correct way of doing science, and method would be the actual implicit expectations. You may or may not have an idea about your implicit expectations, but you clearly have implicit expectations. So this is what scientists say they should be doing, and this is what scientists actually do. I'm going to give you an example to clarify. Suppose we talk about Newtonian method and methodology. There are at least 4 different connotations. Method, methodology, social, and individual. Individual method, that would be Newton's own method, his own implicit criteria that he himself employed when deciding whether to accept a certain idea or not. That would be his individual method. Then here you would have individual methodology. So these would be Newton's openly formulated rules, the ones that he wrote in the Principia. We understand that the two may or may not coincide. And then we move on to the social level, and here we have a method at the social level. This would be the method actually employed by the Newtonian scientific community when deciding which theories to accept and which theories not to accept. And here you would also have a methodology at the social level. This would be methodological dicta openly prescribed by a Newtonian community. This would be those methodologies they would include in their textbooks, encyclopedias, like this is the way you have to do science. There are at least 4 things that we can understand by this. So when we talk about a method in a certain time period or methodology, we have to understand which one of these 4 are we talking about. Now, the meta-theoretical question is which of these 4 are within the scope of the theory of scientific change? Shall we trace changes in methods, in methodologies, in individual level, social level? These all need to be clarified before we can proceed. Finally, there's a question of time, field, and scale. Which time periods we should cover, which fields of inquiry, and transitions of what scale we should cover. Should we only cover grand transitions, let's say from the Aristotelian worldview to Newtonian worldview or Cartesian worldview? Or should we also cover minor transitions? Let's say we used to believe that there are 26 species of dinosaurs, now we believe there are 27 species of dinosaurs. Should we just focus on major ones or the minor ones? This is another question that we have to tackle. Once we finish with the scope, we're going to move on to the possibility of a general theory of scientific change. I want to give you a little prehistory. Until I would say the 1970s, it was generally believed that theories are evaluated by the fixed scientific method. It was generally assumed by the likes of Carnap and Popper and all others of their generation, most of them, that while scientific theories change through time, one thing remains unchangeable, and that unchangeable thing is this universal method of science, this fixed criteria for theory evaluation, the ones that we employ to decide whether a theory is acceptable or not. And so the whole task of the philosophy of science, the primary task, was to try and reconstruct, explicitly state what those requirements are. And as a result of that, you would get your positivist methodology, then your Popperian methodology, Lakatosian and others. But they all agreed that there is this fixed and universal method of science, that the method itself is unchangeable. If we take a timeline, go all the way back to Aristotle, he would also accept this. He would also believe that there are certain fixed rules for conducting science. Fast forward 2,000 years, Isaac Newton, he would agree with Aristotle that there are unchangeable rules for studying natural phenomena. You remember, there's a whole chapter, very small chapter, in the Principia that outlines the 4 Newtonian rules, the way he thought the science should be done. While they would never agree as to what those rules are, but one thing they would agree is that there is one right way of doing science. And then fast forward all the way to 1960s, Karl Popper, he would also agree with them. He would disagree as to what those rules are, but he would also agree that there is an unchangeable method of science. And so it is safe to say that for the most part of the history of human knowledge, up until the 1970s, it was commonly accepted that there is a fixed and universal method of theory assessment. Up until this guy, Paul Feyerabend, he was probably one of the most famous in the camp who argued that there is no unchangeable method of science. And nowadays, I think it's safe to say that we generally accept that there is no fixed method of science, for methods do change. Methods are not something external to the mosaic. They are part of the mosaic. They are here. They are part of the mosaic, so they also change through time. Once we realized this, we had a choice. The first question is the dynamic method thesis acceptable? And by the dynamic method thesis, we mean the thesis that says the methods of science change through time. So is this actually the case? Is it true that methods actually change through time? You still have an option of saying no, and some philosophers still believe that there is, after all, something unchangeable in the foundation of scientific method. So let's go back to the classics and search for the correct explication of this universal core method of science. So that's one option. A more viable option is to agree that methods of science change through time. And then in that case, you have the second question to answer, which is there any logic in the way these methods change? Is the choice between methods arbitrary, or is there any logic? If you say there is no logic, then that would mean to admit that there is no internal logic of scientific change and therefore to end up in relativism. Everyone is free to choose their own methods. That's one option. The other option is to try and unearth the logic that governs changes, not only in theories, but also in methods. So we have three options. Option 1, option 2, option 3. Rudolf Carnap, Karl Popper, Imre Lakatos, they would all be in this camp. Nowadays, we know that this is not really a viable option because we have enough evidence that methods do change through time. And not only historical evidence, we also have theoretical reasons to believe that methods are changeable. In fact, it's one of the theorems of our theory that tells us that methods do change through time. Among those very few who still seem to support this thesis is John Worrall. I'm not sure he would completely agree with this conclusion, but from what he does and what he says, he seems to believe that although some secondary methods do change through time, there is this core method of science that has remained unchanged, at least for the last 300, 400 years. There's a famous debate between Worrall and Loudon, although towards the end of that debate, Worrall seemed to have agreed that Loudon was right, that nothing is sacred and everything is changeable. He still said, yes, everything is changeable in principle, but we all know that, let's say, novel predictions have always been a hallmark of good science. So something is stable despite the fact that methods of science change through time. This is a very tricky position. Anyways, I think it's safe to say that resuming the search for the correct method of science is not really a viable option these days. Paul Feyerabend would be among those who would openly subscribe to this relativist conclusion. Larry Loudon would be a representative of the other approach. And in fact, in 1984, he was, I think, the first who tried to put together a theory of scientific change that would explain changes not only in theories, but also in methods. There are several reasons why it didn't succeed. There are many confusions, let's say method and methodology, individual and social level, acceptance, use, and pursuit. So it never took off the ground, really. Now, where's Thomas Kuhn? Well, with Tom Kuhn, it's always difficult. On the one hand, he seems to be saying that everything is changeable and the methods of science also change when paradigms change. On the other hand, he tries to devise a mechanics that would explain how they change. He talks about these 5 transhistorical values. But then he goes on saying that, no, you know what, but those values also are changeable. And so he's back and forth between relativism and non-relativism. I honestly don't know what he actually had in mind, and I don't believe anyone really understands what Kuhn had in mind. So it's safe to say that he was in a superposition of 2 states, really. Now, the key question here today is, what is the mechanism of scientific change? In other words, can there be a general theory of scientific change? We know that theories change, methods change. Can we actually have a theory that explains how theories and methods change? And the answer is yes, and that's it. Let's go home. Here we're going to study and tackle major arguments against a general theory of scientific change. The argument from the changeability of scientific method, the argument from nothing permanent, the famous arguments from social construction, that science is a social construction and therefore it needs to be studied by sociology. There is nothing emergent about science. And finally, the argument from bad track record. We're going to cover all this. After that, what we're going to do, we're going to focus on the assessment of this theory. And the question is going to be, once the theory is constructed, how are we going to evaluate it? Suppose you created a theory of scientific change. How are you going to assess it? In particular, what method should we employ to decide which theory of scientific change is good and which theory of scientific change is not good? Then, what are the facts relevant in the assessment of this theory? The next one is the question of indicators. Suppose you're a historian, you delve into a certain time period, and you want to unearth their scientific mosaic. Supposedly there is one. How do you go about it? First, how do you know that something is a community? Individuals are easy to pin down. But how do you know that something is a community? And then how do you even know that a theory was accepted? And how do you even know that a method was employed at a certain period of time? Should we look into encyclopedias or textbooks? So this is a question of indicators. How do you know that theories were accepted? How do you know that methods were employed? How do you establish that as a historian? It's not an easy question. So once we cover this, then we're going to move on to the theory proper, to the axioms. At the moment, we have 4 axioms. These are the 4 laws. We're going to cover this. And then we're going to move on to things that presumably follow from the axioms. And this will include many theorems on many different aspects of scientific change. Things like rejection of theories and methods, the contextual nature of appraisal, scientific underdeterminism, the way mosaics split and merge, and then static and dynamic methods, necessary elements, sociocultural factors, the role of methodology. So we're going to cover many different aspects of the process of scientific change. For many of these aspects, we have theorems, but it's up to you to decide whether any of those hold water. So this is what we're going to do. This is a snapshot of what we do have at the moment. So these would be your axioms and the theorems that follow. The reason why we proceed axiomatically and the reason why I've chosen that format of presentation is because it has proved to be very conducive to the criticism of a theory. If you formulate your propositions explicitly and make your logical connections explicit, you make the life of the next generation easier. Because if they happen to disagree with a given part of a theory, they always know what to do. They say, well, this is the proposition that I disagree with. Let's change this. Let's modify this. It makes the task of the modification of a theory more bearable, as opposed to keeping everything in a pure textual format when you just don't know what exactly is being said. Here, everything we say comes in a proposition form. It's either an axiom that doesn't follow from anything, we just postulate it, or it's a theorem that we believe follows from the axioms. That way, if you happen to disagree with something, you either have to show that it's a theorem and there was a mistake in a deduction, and we had cases like that we believe there was a theorem that followed and then it was shown that it didn't follow. Or if you see that everything is logically very nice, everything follows, and yet it doesn't make any sense, then it means that the fault is with the axioms. So you have to go all the way to the fundamental axioms and change maybe 1 or 2 or 3 of them. In any case, this facilitates a piecemeal approach. Now, this changes through time, and this is what it looked like in January of 2013. This is the first iteration. Since then, the zeroth law has changed. A few theorems were shown to be not theorems, and a few new theorems were added. So it's constantly changing. Now, by participating in the seminar, there are 3 ways in which you're going to help. First, you help to scrutinize the current theory and contribute to its advancement. That's the most obvious way, to scrutinize each and every aspect of the theory that we have. The meta-theory, the theory itself, nothing's going to be sacred. Everything is open for discussion. 1 or 2 of us will be making a presentation every week. Read as much as possible if you're the presenter, outline the key ideas, and launch the discussion. Then you're going to help elaborate the online encyclopedia of Scientonomy. You're going to be collaborating with the editors of the encyclopedia to write, review, and modify encyclopedia articles. And finally, there's the essay. It can be theoretical or observational, or both, if you manage to do that. Your essay will be considered for publication in the journal. So we're going to require the same format that the journal is going to require, with a mandatory list of suggested modifications. Even if it's an addition to the theory or the history of the subject, then that's fine too, but that needs to be explicitly stated, that you believe this, but in this paper, I argue that you have to believe that. And so we're going to keep the same format so that the papers are easily publishable. So this is the point of the seminar. Thank you very much.